Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast. This is episode number 89, Docker All the Web Things. Today, on our panel, we have Danny Blue.
Hey, everybody.
And Leon Revel.
Hi.
And our guest today is Manu Marks. Is it Mano or Manu?
Mano.
Mano. I'm batting 1,000 here. so Mano's on the phone. So if he cuts out or anything, he'll be right back. He's also at OSCON, which is I think run by O'Reilly.
That's right. And today is Open Container Day, which has a bunch of companies presenting around container technology.
That's awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work with Docker you've done?
Sure. I'm the Director of Developer Relations for Docker, and I'm in charge of a small team that helps developers know what Docker has and use them. I've been at Docker about 7 months now, and before that I was at Google for about 9 years in a similar role.
So you've been around the block with developer relations, it sounds like.
Cool.
Yes,
sounds nice.
That's right.
So for those people who haven't heard about Docker, what is it really? Like, you hear the containerization. I feel like, I start thinking of like
right.
weird stuff happening.
The basic tech, and tell me if you're still there because it looks like you're freezing. No, you're still there.
I'm still there.
Okay.
Yep, we're here.
So the basics behind containers is that they are small, isolated software packages that run that have all the dependencies they need to run the app that they're running, and they spin up and spin down in a matter of milliseconds. And you can do a complete web server or database within container technology. They're on the continuum of virtualization. So on Linux, they run natively, bare metal, and on Windows and Mac, they'll run in a virtual machine. Although Windows is now working on Windows containers, which also work with Docker, that will run natively in Hyper-V on Windows. So it's pretty exciting. You can run basically a whole bunch of these small containers that may be anywhere from a few megabytes up to a couple hundred megabytes running on your machine, and they run in isolation from each other, so they're more secure than running your standard applications. And there's a whole suite of tools for building out your applications quickly, easily, and deploying them at scale.
Cool. Could you just clarify a little bit on the difference between a virtual machine and a Docker container? Because I think when people are just kind of learning about Docker, I think that's where a lot of the confusion kind of comes in. If you can describe in a bit of detail the differences, that would be brilliant. So
the best metaphor I've heard recently is that a virtual machine is like a house, and containers are like apartments in an apartment building. So each one of them are fully self-contained and have everything you need for living, but the house itself may take up the same amount of space as an apartment building, but have room for one family. They're much heavier weight. They tend to have full-on operating systems in there. You might have all of Windows. You might have a full Linux distribution, whatever you're running. Whereas the container contains a very stripped down piece. So they're on this continuum of virtualization, and you got VMs on the one hand. They may take 10 or 15 minutes to spin up, whereas a container may take milliseconds. And then on the far end, which is a very new cutting-edge technology that is out there, unikernels, which are really just the the barest amount of operating system to run the app that you're running.
So do they just spin up so quickly because they're so lightweight in comparison to VMs?
Yeah, in large part because they're very lightweight, and the Docker engine has been optimized for building up these very small packages. So what you do is you create an image of it, which is basically a template of what you need to run your application, and then you push it to whatever machine that it's running on. And the Docker engine there knows how to build a container from that image. So it's got the whole template of what you need to build just right there, spins right up.
I know it's probably quite a simplistic question, but what are the kind of things you'd run in a Docker container? If it's not like an entire VM, obviously I imagine it can be small applications that you want to be able to spin up and kill off again, or is it kind of lots of different applications, and kind of how is that architected inside?
So in a particular container, you could run a database or a web server or any kind of your app. The real advantage of them comes from the ability to run many containers that each have different pieces of your app. So you're running basically a microservices architecture for your application. So you have one container that runs your web app, one container running your database, one container running a worker that ports data from another container, which is a key value store, and pushes data into the database. There's basically anything that you can imagine running. And here we're primarily talking about server-based applications, I should clarify. Anything that you can imagine running on a server, you can run in a container.
Brilliant. So that means you could quite quickly get environments up and running, and, for example, swap out the type of database if you had those running on different containers and stuff. So one customer setup might want MySQL, and another might want MongoDB or something similar, and that's the kind of thing you'd be able to do quite quickly. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Brilliant. Cool.
It also means that developing in a polyglot development environment is really easy. We have a sample voting app up in the Docker repo on GitHub, and it has the voting piece is written in a Flask Python applications. That's one container. It has a Redis key value store. It's got a Java worker which runs in a separate container, pulls data from the Redis container, puts it into a Postgres database, and then a Node.js front end. So all these things, each one of these images can be done in isolation from each other. So if we have different people working with different languages, it's very exciting that you can, nobody has to care what the other person's developing in.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, that was something that when I first started looking at virtualization, I worked on a couple of projects at previous jobs on Vagrant using VMs, and one of the things I loved about that was if you're dealing with Ruby or Node, there's lots of different versions for different applications, so there's a lot of things that can go wrong that are just because of minor differences in your console and things like that. So it was nice to have some virtual setup where it's just like, Vagrant up, and that just builds this whole thing, and then everybody has the same consistent environment. So the two things that really bugged me about it, though, was that the initial load was just crazy. I could go get some lunch, come back, and it would still be spinning up Apache or Nginx or whatever. npm install took forever. So that was like, after you do that, once it's built once, then it's easier. It's only a few minutes to load up. But also the size. Like if I was on like 6 projects, I could only really have 2 or 3 on my machine because they would be like 20 plus gigabytes of stuff that would be on there.
It's even worse now. You've got SSDs. The run space so quickly. Yeah.
Exactly. So my pain, Leon.
Absolutely.
But I loved Vagrant despite all that. So I know that at HashiCorp they have a successor for Vagrant that uses containerization called Otto. So I was wondering, like, is that kind of how you see for web developers or application developers? moving towards that whole like development to deploy all in a consistent environmental change.
Right. So, containers, because they package up all the dependencies and the operating system and everything that you need, they all run, whatever environment you're running on, it'll run exactly the same.
Sorry, I was muted. Do you see, like the whole model, like from what I read, it was with Vagrant. The missing piece was the deploy. And I think that's the piece that,
right.
that interests most people. For me, it was the consistent development environment and the easy onboarding. But now that, if you're looking at continuous delivery, I'm wondering, like, is that kind of like, is that going to be easier to go from dev environment to deploys really quickly to I guess make the pipeline better for continuous development?
Yeah, so with Docker, you have that because you have these images. It's really easy for a local engine to deploy the image onto a local node, wherever that is. Typically, we're talking about something in the cloud, but you can be running this on premise, whatever. And with built-in tools in Docker, and so far I've only talked about open source stuff. But with the built-in tools in Docker, including Docker Swarm, again, just to be clear, also open source, it makes it really super easy to deploy across many nodes. We had an example in, I think was it March or April, we had Swarm Week, where we showed a demo of doing 1,000 nodes with, I think, 50,000 containers that it spun up, and that took a few hours, but those were 50,000 fully functional applications deployed across 1,000 nodes. We actually had to call up Amazon and be like, okay, so sorry, we're taking over all your capacity of this particular type of node for a few days. Is that all right?
So, and they're like, yeah, it's Swarm Week. Go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, the really great advantage about using Swarm for orchestration is it uses the same Docker API that you would use for a single container. So you're basically deploying a swarm using the same. You're treating a cluster of containers as a single container. And then we have all this sort of like scheduling strategies and everything that you can do. There's even load balancing built into the latest version of Swarm. So it takes care of most of your needs. And then we have paid products that you can do to take care of all the rest of the pieces of that.
Nice. You briefly mentioned the containers are more secure. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more and just kind of describe why, etc.? That's quite an interesting topic.
Yeah, so basically the idea is that within a container you can strip it down pretty easily to just what you need. So and because they each run in isolation from each other and communicating over HTTP, then you're creating this more secure environment. Now, naturally, you always have to be concerned about security, and we just launched a tool called Nautilus, which does security scanning on your on repos that are hosted on Docker Hub, so that you can scan individual images and for known vulnerabilities. But because everything's designed to run in this container, you can do application isolation. We also have a network layer built into the Docker engine, which allows you to do software-defined networking, and so you can define which containers are on which networks, and therefore which ones are actually exposed publicly or not.
Wow, that's cool. So I actually have so that's actually leading into something that I wanted to get into next. So one of the reasons I like AWS, or one of the reasons a lot of people like AWS, is the fact that it's really easy to spin up instances of things with a particular environment in mind. For example, like if you want to spin up a node environment or something like that, it's pretty much a couple button clicks to do something like that. and I think you mentioned Docker Hub before, but or just a second ago. But so for somebody new like me that wants to set up a Docker image with Node or Ruby or whatever it is there like a single source where you can go to get a bunch of examples for that stuff to spin up with that one button click, or do you have to do everything from scratch?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of official images on Docker Hub. So the Node community, Ubuntu, CentOS, I think we have 90 some official images, which are done primarily by the people who develop these open source tools or environments. They create these official images that we've blessed them, we scan them, we say, okay, we know that where this is coming from, and so they've optimized those for images for container deployment. So yeah, and there's a bunch of different versions, and basically if you're at the command line, you're say Docker poll Node, and you get the latest version of Node, and then you can actually get you can optimize it. There's a bunch of tags you can add to that to get the exact Node environment that you want.
Is the community able to share these things as well? Like if I created one that Eric wanted to use, is there an easy way to kind of do that as well, or is it just for official packages?
You push your image to Docker Hub, and anybody can see it.
Cool. So it just doesn't have the official stamp on it. Then it's not being fully checked and stuff. Is that right?
Right. The official nodes are just ones that Docker itself has said, yeah, we know where this is coming from. We know who, and we've scanned it. We've worked with them to make sure that this is right. But anybody, you can share with anybody. I think we've received over 3 billion pulls from Docker Hub, so people pulling an image, and only 20% of those come on official images.
Right. Cool.
On the security note, you had said you had some tools that are available. I know that in the past that was a question as far as like passing information from one container to another, which sounds a little icky to me. Like, what are like the patterns or anti-patterns for something like that? For security.
So yeah, I mean the best pattern is if you're defining a cluster of containers that have maybe different types of nodes that need to pass information between each other, you use a software-defined network so that they can just identify each other on that network, but you only expose a few with public ports. So mostly they're on a network that only can communicate with itself. And then have maybe single or certain types of containers that are defined as the ingress egress to that network.
It's like a self-managed whitelist of IPs.
Yeah, except you don't even have to worry about the whitelist. So we have a tool called Docker Compose, and it's a very simple YAML file, and you just say here you name your networks. And you can define the types, but if you don't define the types, then they're automatically bridge networks. And then when you define a service, you just say, okay, I want my database only on this backend network. And then you can define your web server as on both the backend and the front end, so that only that web server app can pull the data from the database and display it publicly. But you can have multiple containers that are on the backend network, and then they can talk to each other, but not to the outside world.
And when they talk to each other, are they passing gobs of data, or are they messaging or signaling? Like, does it vary? Yeah,
I mean, you think about it as a sort of web services. It's however you would define it in a normal application, however you would define that normally. But you can, instead of having to define it's going to this IP address or this domain, you just say push this to Redis, and it finds a Redis instance and pushes it to it.
Nice.
Does Docker do anything special for any of the typical security concerns like denial of service or SQL injection or anything like that? Does Docker add anything in that kind of area or not?
I'm going to say I'm reaching about the limit of my security knowledge. I'm not the best person on that. The special thing that we did recently is we can scan images. So we can go in and find out what are the different layers in the image, because an image is created basically through sort of an inheritance. So you say, I create a Docker file that says, I want to do this from Alpine Linux.
Right.
And then I add a bunch of stuff to it. And then somebody else could pull from that image and create another one. So in each layer, we go through and examine what's the contents of the layer and say, okay, here's a whole bunch of known vulnerabilities that you should fix. Or, you shouldn't use X, we'll use Y. So yeah. That's what we're doing, and we're pretty aggressive on that level in terms of like denial of service and all that stuff. Much of it you would still need to add in your own stuff, but again, I'm not the security guy.
Cool, thanks.
Sure.
So Justin, one of the other hosts on here, who happens to be the person with the most extensive knowledge in Docker, okay. He left a couple of notes for us. And as web developers, a lot of what we do revolves around like not just services, but also the web browsers.
Right.
So can you run like isolated GUI applications in Docker, like Chrome? And I think he's kind of referring to Jesse Frizzell, if I'm pronouncing it right.
Yes.
And the Docker files that Jesse's been doing?
Yeah, so it's possible, but it's not. Yes, it's possible. I mean, basically, you have to pass references to where's the X Windows server, or whatever your app uses for its display, which is probably an X Windows server. To the container, and you have to open up access to that. It's something that you can certainly do, and yeah, Jessie does amazing things with like running Chromium or Firefox or SoundCloud or a variety of other kind of applications within containers. I think it's a little bit harder to do than. It kind of breaks the cross-platform piece because Windows and Mac don't come with X11 X Windows servers installed, so you have to figure that piece out. And there's a little bit more development work because you're actually accessing resources that run outside the container. But it's doable, absolutely. I even saw somebody had, and I'm blanking on where I saw this, but they'd created a container environment in JavaScript in a browser, so you could actually have a full container environment within the browser. But again, not something that standardly we've had a chance to test or anything.
I wonder if that's how CreationX is doing Git.js, JS Git. Because like on Chromebooks, at least my understanding, I don't own one, but at least my understanding is that you can't access certain things, like you wouldn't be able to get Git the normal ways we might do that. I wonder if there's something with containerization there.
Yeah, this is a largely unexplored area, so I don't know. I think we'll move into that more in the future, and also I think in mobile, we'll start to see, hopefully, some container environments developing there. One of the problems in, say, Android runs on Linux, but it doesn't expose certain kernel elements that are necessary for Docker to run. And I think, iOS is a pretty locked down environment as well, so we can't run them there.
It shows how flexible the Docker and the Docker container system is. Then, if people are kind of using it in all these interesting ways that haven't really been explored just yet. But certainly, I like the idea of having mobile containers or something like that. That would be incredibly useful. Definitely, that'd be great to see.
Yeah, we're excited about that, and partially that's because it's open source. So people have, for instance, ported the Docker engine over to Raspberry Pis. The Hypriot team in Europe has done that particularly, and are using it for IoT kind of things. And we're working on multi-architecture support as well. So
that's exciting.
It really is Docker all the things.
Yes. Yeah. Any app anywhere.
I mean, I think like iOS eventually will be forced to have like some container. They'll have their own container system probably, which they'll market as the best thing ever, and then you'll have to run your own Docker stuff inside there probably.
I don't know. I do know that we worked really closely with them on. We recently released this beta of Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows, where they're running with more native hypervisor support. And we worked really closely with both Apple and Microsoft to make containerization work with their native hypervisor support.
It's super busy because I think I applied for it like a month and a half ago, and I just got my key yesterday, like literally.
Oh, you should have emailed me. I would have gotten you in.
So, well, I didn't want to push my way through the line,
Right.
But it's really come along, and to hear I heard Dan Wallin. I don't know if you've heard of him. Mm-hmm. He's a Microsoft certified professional and Angular expert. He talked about on the .NET Rocks show. He talked about how Windows is really upping their game as far as getting it natively supported, and getting deployments set up within their types of systems. And you talked about it a little bit. Do you know more details of like what's to come with that as far as on Windows?
So for instance, just yesterday, Windows released the second release candidate for ASP.NET 5 for their core CLR, and what that is it's a port of core components from .NET to Linux. So they're working on a full ASP.NET 5 will have a full Linux distribution. And so here's a really fun thing. I actually put up a video on the Docker blog about this. They also have Docker tools for Visual Studio, so you can now do breakpoint debugging for ASP.NET, core CLR, RC2 apps inside Visual Studios. So you run the app inside Visual Studio. It runs a bunch of PowerShell scripts, pushes it to a container, and then actually figures out how to do, like, I can do this breakpoint debugging and change things within the container. It's pretty awesome. It's still that's still a little bit early days. And then on Windows Server 2016, they're now at Tech Preview 5 on that. They'll have native support for Windows containers. So it'll have actual Windows operating system inside the container. So that's really interesting. I don't know when 2016 becomes generally available, but we're really looking forward to that. We're working pretty closely with them on that.
And earlier, like, not to take it back a little bit, but you talked about Docker Hub, right? And how awesome that is. I love that you have the public one, so you can put them. And I think you also get a free private one, like one private one that you can use. I think I saw that.
Yeah. So there's so within Hub you can do a private repository so that they're not publicly available. But also within Docker Cloud, you can do private repositories, and we have an on-premise repository called Docker Trusted Registry. So you can have a completely isolated Docker experience that doesn't touch anything outside of your own stuff, and it's a very secure way to secure your images. Um,
What's
so
the advantage
there-
to that versus like using something like Rancher or some other way of hosting these things?
Yeah,
'Cause you
and
guys are the
there's
canonical,
other
right?
registries out there too. Yeah, so we have there's an open source registry that we released, and other people have developed their own registries as well. So you can there's a standard registry API that you can use.
Just to kind of on a slightly different note, is there different ways of being able to manage all your different containers? Is there like a UI, or is it done all via the CLI? And kind of what is the split with people using it in that way?
So all the open source stuff is primarily through a CLI right now. We have there's sort of an alpha product that we bought a company I think a year ago called Kitematic, and you get that with the download of Docker Toolbox for Mac or Windows. But we also have a paid product called Universal Control Plane, which gives you a UI. This is an on-premise product, so you gives you a full monitoring, deployment, DevOps point of view of all your containers, so you can do the whole build, ship, run piece through that. And then we have in the slightly less expensive, the much less expensive range, we have a Docker Cloud, which allows you to pay by the node that you're managing. It doesn't matter where the node is; it's AWS or Azure or whatever, and you can do through our cloud interface, monitoring and deploying your images.
Cool.
Yeah, first node's free.
So I mentioned before we started that this isn't exactly my area of expertise, but it tends to be something that everybody runs into. Whatever type of development you're doing, you end up being somewhat involved in the full stack, and something that we've talked about a little bit is what seems to be is how easy it is to scale with Docker. Partially because the containers spin up so quickly and things like that. How easy is it for somebody like me with limited knowledge to be able to scale their existing applications? Is it something that am I still going to need like a dedicated backend guy for my for some app I'm building on my own that's exploded, or is it something that Docker can help me do?
Docker can help you do it. It's never going to be fully easy, right? But we remove a lot of layers of the problem. So a big piece of scaling is being able to scale without having to worry about what environment you're deploying to. So Docker already takes care of that. But then with Swarm and Docker Compose, it's really easy to add or pull down nodes as you need them. So it's it's just a simple command line, hey, give me 5 more nodes of this, or 5 more containers of this, or 10 more containers of my web server, or 5 more databases. And then Swarm, knowing where all the nodes are, will just distribute it based on a standard deployment strategy.
That's very cool.
If you have like a lot of different ETL things, a lot of replication you need to do with data, like how does that work with scale, getting all this data to kind of sync up and communicate? I mean, you're using Compose or Swarm or something, I would assume.
So we have a concept called volumes, which is where data you can access files and data that sit outside of a container, and you can share using Docker Compose and Swarm. It's very easy to share these volumes with different containers, different nodes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And using Beta too, I noticed that you ditched VirtualBox. So.
Yes. So on Mac we're using native hypervisor support, which is based on Hyper-V, which we also contributed to. That's an open source project. And on Windows, we use Hyper-V, which means you have to be running on Windows 10 Pro.
Nice. And so
Yeah.
if you have like a huge just like a huge DevOps situation like at certain companies where you have the old way of doing things, a new way of doing things. This happens in application development all the time where you build this monolithic app and then you try and break it out later, and there's all these things happening. But in infrastructure level, it's harder because there's so many more dependencies. Like how do you recommend for teams to start getting, start working with the platform to help alleviate some of the pains across an organization?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that what we're seeing is this movement from these big monolithic applications to a more microservices approach. And typically, what will happen is if a new service needs to be spun up, people will start putting it into the cloud and using Docker containers, or they'll start taking pieces of an existing app and breaking them off. And containerizing them. So that's generally how people will do it. They'll do little segments so that eventually the old legacy pieces they will store separately. It's actually one of the cool things though about containers is with Docker is you can create an image. Say I've got an old legacy app, this big old legacy app that's running on ASP.NET 3.01 or whatever. And, particularly with ASP or with Node, other things, the particular version that you're on, modules will support particular. It's actually really important. You can package all of that up into an image, and then just say, okay, for that functionality, it's all there. We don't need to worry about that. We can build the rest of our app with more modern versions of Node or ASP or whatever it is that you're using.
Does Docker play nicely? You mentioned microservices. Does it play nicely with that type of a pattern? I mentioned it because just over the weekend I started messing around with AWS Lambdas. Or AWS Lambda, and I'm curious is that something you can use with AWS Lambda with Docker, or can you use Docker to set up your own kind of suite of microservices?
My understanding is you can do both. So I think Lambda, and I'm less familiar with it, but I think what you can do is you can take a container and just push it out there, and then it will build the containers as you need them. But then if you want to have more control over how that gets done, your CPU usage, your workloads, then using Swarm, you can very easily replicate that approach. In fact, the most common use case for Docker is with this more microservices approach.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah.
Is there from an environmental standpoint, is there a way that you might, or maybe you wouldn't want to do this, but if you had a container and it was in your integration type environment or your development, and then you tested it out and you're like, this is great, I've tested this, I've tested it on different networks and all sorts of things, but then you want to just have a promote type of functionality. Can you promote that to build that particular build of that container to another environment? Is that something that's scriptable or doable?
Well, I mean, one of the things about the containers is that they'll run the same in whatever environment that they're on. So it shouldn't be a problem. But one of the nice things about the registries and Docker Hub is they support tagging. So you could easily say, okay, here's my image of this type, and if I don't specify a tag, it pulls just whatever your latest is. But I can do experimental or version or whatever you want. It's custom tagging, right?
Nice. Then that would make it easier to just say, then point to this type of point to this tag in this environment. It's pretty awesome.
Right. Yeah.
And so one of the things too, the first time I saw containers was I was doing an experiment with Apache Storm, which is like really good for data aggregation
Mm-hmm.
and heavy computation. And so I found like a JRuby implementation where it was really confusing to me. It still is, but I'm getting used to some of it. But like using it, it had like different servers working together in like clusters, and I was able to get it to run. I just couldn't understand how it worked. And so it's pretty amazing some of the things that you can do with these containers. So thank you for that. I guess there's no question there. It's just I'm just really impressed, and it's one of those things that, like Danny said, like we don't get to use this as a front-end developer. I don't get to do it too often, but I do appreciate it, and when I get to use it, especially with use cases like Vagrant solves.
Yeah, I'm the same as you out really. I'm very used to the Vagrant thing where you've got the whole massive VM and there's loads of stuff in there that can go wrong. So it really promises a really interesting, much quicker way of kind of doing the kind of things we used to. So I'm really excited to really give it a go.
Is it really easy to just take like a base image and just modify it slightly? Like if I found like an Nginx HTTP2 and I just wanted to slightly modify it, like is that quick and easy to do, or is that something you need more expertise
So
in?
the most basic thing you can do is you create a Docker file, which is just a text file, and first line is from Nginx, which is one of our official images, and then you just do okay. Well, I know this is built on Ubuntu, so I do an apt-get install whatever my thing is. I run a little bit of code, and you just put all those commands right into the Docker file, and then you just say Docker builds and give it a name, and point it to the Docker file, and there it is. And that can take building that first image can take anywhere from a few seconds to a minute or so to do, but it's not a long thing.
Cool. What about setting up particular environments? So you've got like a base image which has all kinds of different stuff installed, but let's say you're deploying those particular environments to different customers, for example. Is there a way that you can provide those different environments, different variables to automatically configure things inside the actual container as well? Is that something you can do quite easily?
Oh yeah, it's easy to pass in environment variables. You can do that from the command line or Docker Compose. Yeah, we just have a built-in environment variable system.
Right. Cool.
Yeah, I do know there is. So one of my only experiences using Docker, for some reason we had a hard time figuring out how to pass environment variables to Docker. But yeah, but you have to do it. You have to do it Docker's way, but it absolutely is possible. It's just funny that you bring that up because that is one of the only pain points I've ever had with Docker was trying to pass in environment variables.
But it's pretty easy now, and I don't know when you did it, but now it's just when you're doing Docker run, you just do -e quote variable name equals blah close quote, and that's it.
Most of the repos I've seen with the Dockers and the Docker files have their READMEs are pretty solid, especially the ones obviously on the Docker Hub, like the ones that you guys officially support.
Right.
And I did see that there's a lot more now, even with the CLI and passing in those like different environment stuff. Like I remember the CLI, like if you do Docker-H, right, and you would get like a small list. And now I looked at it after I installed the tools. I was like, oh, there's even these other things like Docker Compose was there the last time I saw too, but there's just so much you can do, but it seems like it's pretty easy to use just a few basic commands to get up and running.
Yeah, it is. I mean, really just Docker run Nginx, and it will pull the image for you and do everything that you need.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So we are starting to get to the last little bit of our show this week. One thing I wanted to ask you, just very anecdotally, is what's one of the coolest things you've seen, either somebody in Docker or somebody just playing around with it? What's one of the coolest things you've seen somebody do with Docker, or just containers in general? Yeah,
so there's a number of there's different directions. One of the cool things I saw last year was at DockerCon in San Francisco. they had a Quake server that was running in a container, and they had clients connected to it, and they migrated. They did a sort of a checkpoint restore, so they migrated it across the world to a data center, from San Francisco to the UK, and the client automatically kept. There was like a short pause, and then you just kept going with the server in the same state. So that was pretty cool. But one of the things that I thought was really incredibly useful, I think, is there's been a number of different, say, bioresearch companies that are using containers because in research, often people will write software to parse, to look for particular genes in DNA sequences. And for just as a for instance, and that's often written by some grad student who is working for a professor, and he writes it on his laptop, and it all runs, or she puts it into their server environment, and it all runs in that because they've spent a lot of time figuring out the environment. And then there's some companies who take that code and then they reproduce it into Docker images so that they can get consistent results so that other people can take advantage of that research, right? So instead of say, having to reproduce exactly the environment to get the software run that was used to detect a particular gene that did something. I'm a little out of my depth in bioresearch, but they can now, replicate that. It's just like, okay, yeah, you just use this image to build a container that runs this code versus a standard data input. So I think that's one of these ways in which you can get this reproducibility effect. Really, just is actually benefiting, I think, how the world works.
That's a really awesome use case.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say the IoT with Raspberry Pi.
That's that. I think there's so much potential there because IoT right now is very very low level. Like, I'm flipping these bits, and they're very environment specific. And if we can port Docker to different IoT platforms, then getting the ability to run just standard apps in different hosts everywhere is, that's going to be really cool.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because of the lightweight usability for Docker. And then you would have something like Tali is an interesting project for IoT too, getting that consistent network connection across things, because networking is a nightmare right now.
Yes, right. Yeah, so if you've got the hosts having their standard networking, and then you can just do a software-defined network within that, it's that's going to make it so much easier for the developers to use.
I think we are out of time now. So, is there anything else we need to mention?
A really quick one, probably. Obviously, the website, and there's easily find loads of really cool documentation, to kind of get up and running with this stuff. But is there any hidden gems that maybe not everybody knows about, like a really cool place to go and learn loads more about Docker?
I think one of the coolest places is going into the Docker repository on GitHub. There's so many different projects, and there's a lot of documentation that's in there on particular things. And we just launched a new community tutorials repo there, which is github/docker/labs, which gives it's only got like 5 tutorials there, but we're actually accepting pull requests from the community. We're really excited to get people contributing to that, really interesting kind of use cases that we may not have the time to fully document ourselves, but that that the community can help us with.
That's a brilliant idea, because it's always so much easier to understand things with proper examples you can play around with and stuff. Cool.
Yeah.
I found some interesting reading on like CodeShip.io and also Docker, not Docker. I'm sorry, that makes sense. There's also DigitalOcean. So DigitalOcean has some good tutorials there for obviously geared towards their setups, but
Right. Yes. Yeah. And we also have a set of Docker captains. This is sort of like our experts program, our MVP program. So we're really happy about that. That's docker.com/captains. It's great. There's also 260, 65 meetups around the world that people can go to learn more about Docker.
Cool.
that's pretty awesome. I'm looking forward to see how that experts group grows.
Yeah. We just launched that officially in April, so hopefully that's going to grow very rapidly. And of course, come to DockerCon.
Yeah, DockerCon. And if people want to find you, what's your Twitter handle? How can they contact you?
I'm ManoMarks on pretty much everything. So @ManoMarks on Twitter is the best place. Plus ManoMarks on Google+. I'm @ManoMarks on GitHub. I'm the only ManoMarks in the world, so it's very easy to find me.
Well, that's an awesome thing.
Yeah.
Fortunate.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I looked myself up one time and I found this Norwegian wrestler. Just ended up in the search results.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. I know you're very busy over at OSCONs, and we appreciate all the work you're doing for open source. And Docker is an amazing project and tool set. So thank you so much for coming on.
And thank you for having me.
You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at +the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at @eIsaacson
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.